we've wasted trillions and trillions on unprofitable wars of intervention that have brought us nothing but grief, in Europe, nothing but an invasion of people that they don't want and can't maintain. So at some point, somebody in Europe, and I think Orban is leading the charge on this, but I think the rest of them are going to wake up and say, this is a dead end, especially when it becomes clear that the Russians are not interested in marching all the way to the Polish border. Not to say that they won't do it if they're forced into it, but the bottom line is that's not what they've been about. They've never been about, well, we just want to capture more and more territory. Russia is already the largest country in the world. How much more territory do they need? And I think the answer is not much. But they've effectively reconquered or retaken or re-annexed what was new Russia under Catherine the Great. That's something that made sense because the people that live in those areas were Russians culturally, linguistically. They're happy to do that. We don't seem to want to recognize any of that. We seem to want to maintain this artificial construct called the Cold War in new form. It's a dead end. It's not going to work. And I think the Europeans, who are now approaching a depression, frankly, total destruction in industrial and scientific terms, are simply going to wake up, put new people into power. They're coming. It doesn't matter how hard Merz tries to keep the alternative for Germany out of power. It doesn't make any difference. They're going to come to power. And when they come to power, they're going to reverse all of this. And the first place they're going to go is Moscow. They're going to have a meeting right away. And they're going to throw out all this nonsense. And you're going to see the Germans march out of NATO at high speed. And remember that one of the arguments for all of this nonsense was we have to keep the Germans in NATO. That's part of the rationale for hostility to Russia, because that means Germans and Russians won't cooperate. And if Germans and Russians don't cooperate, we can live with the status quo in Washington in perpetuity. Everyone is vassalized in subordination to us. All of this is failing. It's all going to collapse.
You know, you mentioned this Cold War mentality and even a lust, if I can use that term, to go back to the Cold War mentality, go forward into a new one. One of the ways that the current leadership, they may get out of power one day, they're not yet. And these guys that are in power keep talking about this coalition of the willing, or this reassurance force, and they keep going down this path, and there still are to this day trying to get Trump to agree to, not only to agree to it, but to participate in it with some kind of, whether it's air support, logistics, etc. They keep saying, hey, whenever this is brought to some kind of negotiated settlement, we want our troops in this demilitarized zone of support, which is odd because if you have military there, it's not a demilitarized zone, but nevertheless, they want those in there. Well, Putin, again, being very plain and plain spoken, said a couple of days ago, that ain't happening.
If some troops appear there, especially now while the fighting's continuing, we proceed from the premise that these will be legitimate targets for destruction.
And you can see there that venue thought that was a really good idea, that they would be destroyed of those. So that's not something that would scare a lot of Russians. Many of them are actually pushing more aggressively in that path now. What does that tell you about the state of affairs and the likelihood that this war can come to any kind of conclusion soon?
Well, there are two things that have to be taken into consideration. The first is the use of this terminology, coalition of the willing. This goes back to the 1990s. Almost immediately after the Soviet state collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, there were people in Europe that were happy to be part of NATO, but they saw NATO as being exclusively defensive. And so when the Yugoslav Civil War peaked and we made the decision to exploit the confusion and chaos in Yugoslavia by attacking the Serbs, whom we blamed, rightly or wrongly, for everything that was wrong in Yugoslavia and in the Balkans, you immediately had to turn to this new phrase, coalition of the willing, because most of your alliance members were not interested in going to war with the Serbs. In other words, they weren't interested in a military intervention and sustaining it. So we held these meetings to get people on board to supply troops, to provide resources. And so many members would say, okay, well, we'll ship you some trucks. We'll send a medical support team. But we don't want any soldiers involved. We have to understand that the notion of a coalition of the willing within the framework of the NATO alliance is an expression of weakness, not strength. I mean, if you're trying to convey the impression to the Russians that you have this enormously powerful alliance that stands to destroy them or defeat them if they refuse to do whatever it is we want them to do, and you turn around and say, oops, well, wait a minute, what we really have is a coalition of the willing. And that means, the French and British armies that together, they're actually meaningless as in a hill of beans concept. They're just not meaningful forces. And oh, by the way, well, the Germans are now going to spend money. Well, they're going to spend money, but German nationalists inside the German army, people that are fed up with the terrible leadership in Berlin, are now being driven out of the army. Well, if you're going to drive nationalists out of the army, you're not going to have an army. That all of us, everyone who serves in his respective or her respective country in uniform is by definition a nationalist. So the whole thing is a catastrophe. It has no chance of success. And the idea that some portion of Ukraine could be occupied by the so-called coalition of the willing is rightly dismissed out of hand by Putin, because why are the Russians fighting? They are fighting to prevent adjacent territory from being occupied by foreign forces that are hostile to Russia. Now, if that's the raison d'etre for the war, why would anyone think that you could pick a piece of Ukraine, whatever is left over, and say, well, we'll settle for this. So we have our toe in the pond. We can say we still own a portion of the pond. It's meaningless. It's stupid. It's unacceptable. But that's
let me ask you just on the logic of it, because we to the Western audience, it does sound tough. It's, man, we're going to put these combat troops in there, and that's going to be a real deterrent. That's going to keep Putin from going further, and it will serve as a deterrent for him to do that in the future. But then one has to ask, and I think that the Russians are very keenly aware of this, is that if you're not willing to fight for Ukraine today, why do you think that they would be willing to fight and die for Ukraine tomorrow? I don't understand the logic of that.
Well, this has always been the issue. The real question, I think it was Anatol Lieven who raised the issue. He said, this will be decided by the people who are willing to fight. In other words, the Ukraine war. He said, now the Ukrainians are willing to fight, but what about everybody else in NATO? And that answer was, well, not so much. And the one nation that sent forces over there and swore allegiance to the Ukrainian state and died in great numbers for the Ukrainian state were the Poles. And now the Poles at least have sobered up to the extent that the new president says there will be no more Polish soldiers in Ukraine. Well, that's a good thing. But in the final analysis, your point is accurate. Nobody's interested in dying in Ukraine. People in France or Germany or Austria or any of these other countries, have no interest in marching 1,000 miles east in order to come to grips with the Russian army. I mean, what a dumb idea. That's the biggest mistake you could possibly make. So, at this stage, it's shadow boxing. There's nothing serious about it. That means that it's up to President Putin, his inner circle, to make the decision. And I think we're seeing the beginning of that with this punishing strike. I think they're going to go after all of the targets of command and control, which means the people who are in charge over in Ukraine. And I think they're going to start moving further west. Now, will they go all the way up to the river and stop? I don't know. But if you talk in terms of creating neutral zones and occupied zones, the Russians will have to go through because they won't accept that. That's sort of like saying, well, we just fought a war in Mexico, and northern Mexico is going to be a neutral zone. No one is there, and it'll have its own independent government. Then central Mexico, well, that's going to be something else. We're not really sure what it is yet, but it could be, have the presence of foreign forces in it. I mean, it's crazy. We would never accept that. Why would the Russians accept it? So we need to be honest, but we don't want to be honest, because to be honest means the premise for the war itself was always stupid. It was never correct. It was never necessary. We created this mess, and I'm serious. It's Washington, because you pull us out of this equation, it's over. And President Trump should understand that, but he is doing the opposite of what I thought he would do. He's doubling down on the policies of his predecessor. He's making a confrontation with Russia over Eastern Europe, over Eastern Ukraine, more likely, not less likely. And we all know another war is beginning to take shape in the Middle East. That's inevitable. Does he really think he's going to get any cooperation out of Moscow or Beijing or anybody else in a war between Israel and Iran? No, he's not. You know, this is the sort of failure to think on multiple levels. No one looks at the implications. No one has done, as we used to say in the Army, branch and sequels for an operation. None of that has happened. And unfortunately, that's not something that President Trump is inclined to do. He's very resistant to the kind of study and preparation that would go with a meaningful summit.
And you know, Doug, I have to wonder really what is in the mind of the president, because on the one hand, he talks about, I want to get a negotiated deal. I want to get this thing over with. I want to get the killing stopped, etc. He's going to talk to Putin. Apparently, he's going to do it again this week. We'll see what comes of that. But you just saw, we trotted out Besant there, and he's going to try economic warfare again, which was a complete and utter disaster. And then you have members of President Trump's party in the House of Representatives seem to also be going in a direction to where we're looking at maybe trying to put some pressure points on China and India and several others, as was voiced here by Representative Mast over the weekend.
We have to deal with those that are on the outside, that are still allowing, because of their relationships, their cooperation, Russia to continue this war. And it really puts to a fine point that because of cooperation, Russia, China, India, North Korea are essentially at war with Ukraine, Europe, the United States of America because of those cooperations.
I mean, what the hell are you talking? They're at war with us, and that's something that we want to pursue. Because and even before you comment on that, let me show you what the other half of that equation is from the Russian side, talking about where they're going with those very same members of the axis of evil, if you want to go back to that. Here's Lavrov.
It is a demonstration that three great powers, representing three great civilizations, are aware of the commonality of their interests in a number of areas. This does not mean that everything coincides 100%. But there are clear tendencies for China, Russia, and India to develop their partnership, deriving mutual benefit from the areas where we have the same interest. And these interests lie in the development of the economy, in solving social problems, and in improving the well-being of the population. All this perfectly fits into the overall concept of the RIC trio, which was predicted back in the mid-1990s by Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov. Since then, it has taken shape, and numerous meetings have taken place. At present, we are preparing the next format of the trio, first at the level of foreign ministers. I am sure that later we will also think about a special summit.
So we've seen, Doug, that all of our actions from the Biden administration forward have shoved all of these folks together, and now then they're taking advantage of that, and they're actually forming a pretty powerful economic bloc. And now then we're talking whether it's Besant or Mast and part of Trump's party seem to be trying to shove them more together. I mean, what do you make of this contradiction?
Well, you've got to understand the mentality in Washington, D.C., of which President Trump has simply become a part. We used to think he would be different. He's not. He's indistinguishable from everybody else inside the Beltway. What is this mentality? If you go back to the 50s and 60s, as we began to develop these alliances and these trade relationships, our economic partnerships resulted in the militarization of our relationship with foreign countries. Because at the time, if you traded with the United States, it meant that you probably didn't trade with the Soviet Union or the communist China or anybody associated with them. So we militarized our trade alliances, trade relations. So we're looking at what's happening with BRICS, and we are imputing the same desire to militarize relations that we have had. In other words, we're projecting our predisposition on the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians. Well, that's stupid, and it's uninformed because, quite frankly, Those countries are, contrary to what was asserted, they're not interested in going to war with us at all. What they're interested in is what I was pointing to before with China. We spend trillions to intervene in countries, then we try to change those countries into a facsimile of ourselves. Then we link those countries economically, we think, to our interests. That's not what the BRICS Belt and Road concept, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, none of those organizations are about that. They are genuinely about building shared prosperity. So trillions are going into the investments that will make them wealthy and successful. If you watch the parade in Beijing, lots of people were convinced that they were watching evidence for China's readiness to march all over the world and conquer everything. Not on your life. What you see is how prosperity is the foundation for defense. That's what you were watching. That is something that Eisenhower understood. Prosperity is key to defense. Without effective economic strength, development, and the prosperity that flows from it, your society fails, and more important, your military has no chance of success. That was the great lesson that he took from the Second World War. We've thrown that overboard. We focus exclusively on threats, backing those threats quickly with not just the threat of sanctions, but also the use of military power. You know, why would you have a summit with President Putin at Elmensdorf Air Force Base in Alaska? You welcome him, and what do you have? A raid all around you. All of these combat aircraft. What do you have above you? An overflight by a B-2. What's the point here? Is that something that you would expect at such a meeting? If you're trying to form, develop, foster a positive relationship in pursuit of prosperity and peace, is that what you do? Highlight your military capability and power? It would have made more sense had he a guard from the old guard and the Marines or something standing there in full dress uniform with a band. That would have made sense, and had both the Russian and U.S. national anthems played. That's what you should have done. That's not what we did. We did the opposite. So again, Trump is all about threats and bullying, and he's not going to accept anything that doesn't make him look good. He's going to reject any solution that does not place him at the center as the one who is in charge and is responsible for everything. It's a catastrophe. That's not what this is about. He's forgotten that he's the president of the United States and is leading the American people. The American people have no interest in going to war. The few that want to cheer bombings from the sidelines need to be ignored. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. They've never been to war. They'll never go. They are a danger to our society because of the cavalier way in which they address this issue of war. So I don't know what you can do at this stage. Obviously, we have to hope for the best, but I think Besant is on a fool's errand. The Europeans will desert this. Everyone will desert it because everyone wants to trade. Now, hopefully you can trade on a basis that is mutually beneficial. That's what we should be focused on. That can be achieved. But no one is interested in going to war, least of all the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians. It's all nonsense.
And you know, the one constituent that is very much interested in war is Volodymyr Zelensky. And I think all of these things, when you see Trump, you know, making all these threats, but then not following through with them, but then now talking about going down sanctions, that's just music to Zelensky's ear. He was interviewed on ABC News over the weekend, and he was reinforcing that. Yes, that's definitely what we need to do. We need to put more oil sanctions because that will crush the Russian economy and bring them to the table, et cetera. But then he goes on this, I think, really disconnected from reality, part 17, and exposed why he just can't figure this stuff out. Here's what he's saying now is his definition of victory.
What does victory look like in Ukraine?
Victory, to my mind, Putin's goal is to occupy Ukraine. This is to destroy us, occupied. And did he occupy it?
No.
It mean that he didn't win. it means that we have Ukraine.
But he still wants to win.
Yes, but till he didn't occupy us, we win. And I think so, because we have our country. And of course, he understands it very clearly. He wants, of course, to occupy us totally. For him, this victory. And until he can do it, the victory is on our side. Very painful in the war, because a lot of losses. So that's why, for us to survive is a victory. Because we are surviving with our identity, with our country, with our independence.
Talk about kind of moving the goalposts. You remember at first it was, we're going back to the 1991 borders. We're going to recapture Crimea. And then it was in 23. Well, all right, we're going to go to the Azov coast. We're going to break through there. And now it's just, well, he hasn't occupied everything, so we're a winner. I mean, what does that tell you about the mentality on the Ukraine side and their willingness to actually make a negotiation to end the war?
Well, the first question is, who is Zelensky? Who appointed him or put him in position? Remember the platform he ran on when he first came into public view? And that was a peace platform. I will settle issues with the Russians. And that's one of the reasons that he was widely supported all over Ukraine, both in the eastern Russified portions of the country and the rest of the country. Now, he lied, obviously. So who backed him? Who put him there? If you look at the people that are behind him, they're all fundamentally committed to the destruction of Russia. And as I've said many, many times, who is Zelensky representing? When he says our identity, I'm 100% for the survival of the Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian nation and people. But the Ukrainian nation and people are not identified closely or perfectly with the borders that existed. And back in the 90s, even Brzezinski tried to persuade President Clinton that he needed to raise the issue of borders in Ukraine, because Brzezinski privately said Eastern Ukraine is Russified. It's not genuinely Ukrainian, and it hasn't been for a very long time. But these issues never come up for discussion because we have taken a position that borders anywhere, everywhere cannot change. But we know from the last 500 to 1,000 years of European history that borders in Europe have repeatedly changed. They change all the time. And it is by changing borders, sometimes by moving populations around, that you eventually achieve peace, which is why the crown heads of Europe did those things. It's primarily because they did not want wars to continue indefinitely. He is doing things that make no sense for the Ukrainian population. I wish we had time and we could put a series of maps up over the last 500 years and show you what this entity called Ukraine looked like at any given point in time. And at least a third or more of it was never part of Ukraine. That's the bottom line. And this construct is not meaningful. It has never been that meaningful. And it's the first thing that should go down and go away in favor of something that's sustainable. And we have refused to do that because we see benefit or profit in our minds from keeping Russia at war in Ukraine.